I'd like to introduce our first speaker today, Oscar, who is a research assistant at Newcastle University, so he's come from far away. And he's just received his, achieved, I should say, his PhD from the University of Iceland. And his particular expertise is in landscape archaeology and the North Atlantic in general. So it's with great pleasure that I'd like to introduce him to talk about the Swan Road. We often talk about the Whale Road here when we're talking about the Viking, so it's nice to have a slightly different description. So we have, I say, one of our speakers won't be here, so we have a little bit more time, we're a little bit more relaxed, but we will stop a little bit early so we can get coffee first. And again, it's 20 minutes of talking, and then a little bit more time, 5 or 10 minutes for questions before we get the next speaker. And I won't be too brutal because we have a little bit more time, but I'll stick that up about 5 minutes before before finishing. So just keep an eye. But sometimes I've noticed when speakers are so concentrated on their notes, they never notice when you're flashing up a arm. So without further ado, as everyone says, thank you, Oscar.
Yeah, so new I've got my doctorate that I had to write it on my... and the Swan Road was nicked from James Heensley's translation of Boatbuilding, so I don't take it as my own. Okay, so what I want to do in this paper is to present a way to capture the relationship between sea, land and communities, and the scales that they can be studied and compared between different areas. This paper is not about island culture in general, per se, but I will draw on aspects of this in my case study. Nor is it about the Northern Isles, rather it will draw material and field experiences from Iceland, specifically in an area called Breiðafjörður in West Iceland. And I guess the paper really is principally about trying to find a kind of a line of inquiry needed to compare and contrast Viking communities across the North Atlantic and the North Sea, so that different relationships between, for example, the sea and the land and Viking communities in particular can be kind of assessed. I should just say that the work that I'm presenting is a work in progress, so it's not fully formed yet, but it forms part of a larger research project in which we'll be examining 3 complementary case studies for the east of England, Northern Isles, so Northern Isles is in there but not in this paper, and West Iceland, and examine them in ways in which the Viking communities interact between the sea and the land. And of course follow this through time as far as is feasible. My co-conspirators are the Centre for Nordic Studies in Orkney, Alex Sandmark and Victoria Whitworth, and also Ragnar Evertsson, who is based in the University Centre in the Westfjords, and my 2 colleagues in Newcastle, Sam Turner and Scott Ashley. So what I hope to kind of bring to the captain's table, so to speak, is a kind of a clear historical perspective on the nature of the community interactions with the sea. For instance, I want to look at Vikings as a kind of maritime culture that were quite literally imbued with the sea, whether this is considered metaphorically through text and oral traditions, or whether this is reflected in the everyday or the special materials that they used and were connected to from the sea. However, I guess I want to kind of ask quite an important question that I think has kind of been taken for granted a little bit. That's what we need to do is kind of assess these marine associations and really question what it actually meant to have the sea at the heart of culture, and obviously how this has shaped cultural development over the long term. So, to begin with, this assessment on the relationship between that sea, land and communities is based, as I said, in this area in Breiðafjörður in West Iceland. So I don't know how much you know about Breiðafjörður, but it's a relatively shallow sea with a fjord and several bays, but a multitude, over 3,000 islands and inlets and skerries, as well as rocky outcrops. The areas close to the shore where the bulk of the settlements on the islands were located. About 200 or so of these islands were at one time inhabited, whether seasonally or permanently, although many of them have been abandoned in more recent times. This farmer here, Jonas, he was the last farmer at Scala, but he left it just a few years ago. So historically, what we know about Bleidafjord is that it's mentioned in several sagas, one being the Laxidala saga, obviously acting as a kind of stage for the characters that played out their lives in it. Flate, another larger island, was probably a Viking centre of some kind, but later had a monastery that we know most about in the 12th century. And that's where the famous Flate book was produced and kept. In later times, some of the islands contained sizable populations. For example, Biatneri contained 84 people, Hoskell, Stay, 46 in the 1703 census. But these are quite exceptional places, both fishing stations, so that populations at a particular time of the census might have fluctuated seasonally. Flate is also reputed to have over 300 people in the mid-20th century. So the comparative nature of this project really is to be used to assess different ways in which sea affected and shaped people's worldviews and how. So as I say, the work that I'm presenting is based on this collaborative research project with colleagues I just mentioned, but also the work that I'll be presenting here is primarily based on research that I was conducting with colleagues at Fornistoften, the Institute of Archaeology in Iceland. The questions that form the core part of the research, the larger research project, are, and obviously this paper, how are communities different in their articulation of the sea? And how has the sea influenced their agencies and structures over time? We have been asking in what way did the experience of the sea voyage shape the close bond that developed between groups and forging maritime character of communities and people in terms of the colonisation of places like Iceland and other places, but this is not a question that I'll be addressing here. It's this meeting of the kind of land and sea that and shore that I really kind of want to look at, and I think this brings in my sense, an idea of a third way of understanding who these people were, not just simply by referring to them as sea or land, but thinking about them this third way together, understanding identities, past identities through a mutual set of relationships in which sea and land form a coherent unity. So any kind of cultural ideology or physical expression is seen in light of both the sea and the land. And so in this process, the environment or the non-human in this narrative is a kind of equal partner with humans. And so I think in any attempt to understand the cultural identity, particularly of people that were imbued with the sea, we have to consider this union and these set of externalized factors more fully. So for this paper about Bleidafjord, I identify the entanglement of seascape and landscape features and assess what can be gleaned from historical sources, archaeology and place names about the nature of this relationship. And to do this, I'm using a method called historic seascape characterization, which I'll refer to in this paper as HSC for short. So HSC is a method for classifying the seascape and the coast landscape areas. It's a kind of map regression practice which takes present-day data, primarily from maps, but also from historical data, to move back in time in order to derive an understanding of the past and the present. Classification, or rather characterization, of the sea and landscape creates a framework with which to link kind of intangible effects of living close and with the sea that lie at the heart of the culture, with the tangible physical properties of the sea itself. So by using HSC, what people thought about the sea and how they articulated this relationship is examined beyond more common forms of evidence. And by more common forms of evidence, I mean things like material culture, like books, ships, artifacts, iconic architecture. But these are kind of brought together in a kind of spatial representation using Geographical Information System, a GIS. The approach takes a particular broader view of this set of relationships about identity in land and sea by examining the very deliberate spatial and temporal agencies that reinforce the maritime identities that characterize, for example, Viking culture. This impression of the past, really, of the seascape, shows a very busy and dynamic series of interactions, and this is the kind of intention of this project to capture these. So a little bit about what HSC is and what it's based on. It's based on historic landscape characterization, a project initiated by English Heritage in the 1990s, which is basically a management tool to actively manage and shape any change in the landscape context. But what I'm applying here is kind of the idea that this type of approach, this historic seascape characterization and historic landscape characterization, can be used as kind of a research tool in itself. So the intention of the HSC is not really to replicate existing data sources, but to bring them together so that the kind of juxtaposition of them leads to kind of new insights and new questions. For example, putting tidal and current data into GIS alongside historical descriptions from a saga might lead to kind of useful interpretations about the motivation and the feedback for activities in particular places. And undeniably, the Norse Vikings coming to Iceland obviously had a huge effect on both the seascape and the landscape. The sort of change in orientation from a landscape to a seascape is quite significant here. So what it's doing is it's examining the seascape and the landscape, and from the point of view of the sea, by mapping areas that share similar kind of historical trajectory and character. I use a list of sort of classification types that are used to spatially define historical processes that have shaped the seascape. It's kind of a hierarchy of types. So the mapping of the seascape kind of retains, well, I'd argue that it retains the kind of vibrant, dynamic nature of spaces like Boatbuilding, but also represents the seascape comprehensively and provides the basis for a comparative view, because the seascape can be characterized consistently in the same way between different areas. So we legitimately can compare, for example, West Iceland with east of England or Orkney. So in order to make a characterization, the researcher must have a knowledge and understanding of how the historic seascape has developed in the area. And this will include sort of looking at sources like map sources like these include Danish admiralty charts that date from the 18th century to the 20th century. And this source kind of contains information on sea and land places with a maritime character, as well as navigation routes and markers amongst other features. I've also used pilot navigation books that show the horizon from approach to a shore uses coastal as well as larger landscape features. And this shows perhaps a kind of deeper knowledge about how people in the past used elements of the sea and the land together. This, coupled with kind of local informant knowledge and archaeology, also add to the kind of characterization, but also kind of allow us to take the time depth back to periods such as the Viking Age. So starting to collate the data to carry out an HSC of Baileyfield, and what begins to emerge is the multiple and significant ways that people who lived there inhabited the seascape and how they did that. The mapping of different character types reveals the nature of the encounters and interactions with the sea and an environment that was essentially shaped by the sea itself. Names of places in particular and the occasional transportation of sea names onto the land. In doing so, it's not hard to suggest that what we can say about the Viking settlers who inhabited the islands and those that inhabited Baileyfield itself through to the mid-20th century share a common type of adaptation to this environment. While material culture and technologies have changed within the Baileyfield community today, the process of working with the sea and how it continues to shape worldviews has not really changed that significantly.